ومن والاه ما بعد. We hope and we pray that you all are doing well, inshallah ta'ala. Tonight, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He blesses you all, keeps you protected, inshallah ta'ala, and makes us among those who follow the sunnah of His Messenger, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So today, we are usually doing our top 50 hadith, and we've taken a small detour. It's still part of the same series, inshallah ta'ala, but this is to aid. These are the tools we talked about. These are the 10 tools to aid the Muslim, the individual, in reading the Sunnah, right? Why? Because we are going to come up upon some problematic hadith, and we say this not that we have a problem with the hadith, but that in understanding them or applying them or misapplying them, a person can run into some problems. And so there's the toolkit, these top 10, not top 10, but these 10 tools, inshallah ta'ala, to aid the believer in how to read the Sunnah. Very briefly, the ones that we went over, we'll go over them again, inshallah ta'ala, as a refresher. We said number one was having sincerity in engaging with the Sunnah, meaning a person is sincere in their reading and is sincere to their paradigm. So if you're a Muslim, obviously you're sincere to the idea that the Prophet ﷺ would never contradict himself, that the Sunnah is protected, etc. But if you're coming from a different paradigm, your sincerity is to whatever paradigm you have. So if I'm reading the Sunnah maliciously, meaning I want to find faults, I want to find problems, you could definitely do that. Of course, this is why there's a whole group of Muslim scholars that have actually dedicated their lives to, dissecting these presumably problems one by one. Alhamdulillah, we have scholars like that. So sincerity, you have to be sincere to the material, right? And even if you're not, let's say a person is not a Muslim, they're watching, and they want to read the Sunnah, you have to be sincere to even the material that you're reading. You can't, when you pick it up, you have to understand that there's a legacy behind this, there's a methodology, there's a lot of things that go in there. A lot of times people just pick up the book and they start to want to read on their own. And even if they're not Muslims, they're like, what do you guys do with this? What do you say about this? What do you say about that? And that they don't realize that we could do the same thing about a lot of a lot of other things. Allah musta'an. So number two is being patient. That a lot of times we won't find, we live in a day and age when we want instantaneous answers for everything. And a lot of times we won't have instantaneous answers for everything, but that doesn't mean that the answer is not there. The answer is there, it's just going to take you some time to research and to find. Remember, a lot of what we're looking in has a long legacy and a huge history. And in fact, there's books and books and books and volumes. And a lot of times what you can access through the internet is actually but a small portion of actually what's available, especially when you're searching in English and most of the material is in Arabic. And even in the Arabic sources, we have makhtutat. If we tried to digitize just a lot of the makhtutat that we have, that's a huge effort, and these efforts are still ongoing. So patience is needed. Number three, that we said is access to a person of knowledge. And we put this here even though we said that this is to aid the person in reading, but I still recommend, and many scholars still recommend, having access to a person of knowledge, your local imam, a local sheikh, a person that you trust, so a student of knowledge. Scholar of hadith is the ideal, obviously, because this is what they deal with day in and day out. When you have someone that's available to answer questions, who this is what he does day in and day out, you know what I mean? He lives and breathes hadith 24/7 and has been doing this for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. That's very different than somebody who's read one book of, introductory to Mustalah al-Hadith, and he's like, Yallah, Bismillah, let's go. It's going to be very different, right? So we have to, access to patients, to people of knowledge is obviously very important. Number four, knowledge of Arabic, and this is a given. And in fact, there's a whole category of dictionaries, early dictionaries. These were written before any dictionary is written of the English language, right? Dictionaries just dedicated to these strange terms that are used in hadith, just like there were for the Quran, there were for hadith, meaning there's terms that you're never going to find, and you have to go back to this. Even people who speak Arabic, we need these, and so these are invaluable books. And number five, as another category of this, is access to the shuruh, which are the books that explain the hadith. And literally for every book of hadith, there are many, many shuruh that are available, and a lot of times they differ in their scope, they differ in what they cover. Some you will find are very brief, they just give you ma'an and kalimat, this and this, and then some go into a lot of detail. That's number five. That's where we ended last time. Today we are on number six. So number six might sound that it deserves to be number one, but I'm putting it here for a reason, and that is checking for the authenticity of said hadith. Meaning I have to check, is it sahih, is it hasan, is it da'if, etc. Right? We know these, we've heard these terms before, But a lot of us don't necessarily know what these terms mean. And so inshallah ta'ala we'll clarify what do these terms mean. We have to know, number one, that the science of hadith, now this might seem this might seem problematic, but in fact it's not. Because even early scholars have, they know this. They take it as a fact. That when we grade a hadith, the grading of the hadith is a probabilistic science and not an exact one. It's a probabilistic science, meaning it's probabilities. This is why the word sahih, even, just to rewind a little bit, even somebody like Anas ibn Malik, radiallahu anhu, he served the Prophet ﷺ for 10 years, lived with him, right? Heard so many ahadith, did so many things. He narrated a lot of ahadith, and even later on in his life, what did he used to say after every hadith that he narrated? He used to say, أو كما قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. This is him. And then this was his habit. This is a very well-known fact. If a person reads all the narrations of Anas, he would, at the end, when he says, قال, especially if he says, so you'll find most of the ahadith, by the way, that they narrate are about his actions and not verbatim statements. Because even somebody like Anas knows, it's very dangerous for me to say, the Prophet definitively, unequivocally, certainly said 1, 2, and 3. Because من كذب علي متعمدا فليتبوأ مقعده من النار. Whoever lies about me intentionally lies, let him find his place in the hellfire. Meaning he's going to the hellfire la mahala, without any doubt. If you lie about what the Prophet said or did, you're going to the hellfire. Not ironically, this hadith, فليتبوأ مقعده من النار, this hadith is the most prolifically narrated hadith in all of our books of hadith. It is narrated by over 80 different companions. And each one of those companions has multiple chains leading back to it. So this is the most widespread hadith in all of the hadith corpus, which basically tells you, don't narrate hadith unless you're certain. Right? That's basically what it's saying. Don't narrate hadith unless you know what you're talking about. This is why so many of the companions were very careful. They tried to make sure that they weren't, making something up. And this is why, even later on, when scholars are grading hadith, they know that ultimately it's probable. We can't definitively say, even if, so here's the thing, Anas heard it. But because so many years is coming, he knows human, he's talking about his own human fallibility. He's a human. The Prophet ﷺ is ma'soom, right? He's safeguarded from making these types of mistakes, but Anas is not. Anas is one individual. Now we as Sunni Muslims, we believe that the Sunnah as a whole is protected, yes, because it's part of Wahy, without a doubt. However, this is why when you look at different narrations, you'll find slight differences between the wording. One narration says this, but they'll agree on majority of the content, right? 90%, 95%, 99%, they'll be agreeing. There's just one word that here or there that's slightly different, not a problem. But why is the wording slightly different in one or the other? Because at the end of the day, it is a probabilistic science, meaning in terms of grading. So when they say it's sahih, they say it's authentic, basically they're saying, we know that the Prophet ﷺ that this happened. Right? When we say that it's hasan, when we say that it's acceptable, meaning it is acceptable, the meaning is correct, etc., there's no problem in the narrators, maybe there's some dabt issues, there's some exact issues, etc., but we can accept it. What about when it's da'if, when it's weak? What does this mean? When we say that the hadith is weak, does that mean we reject it? No. Why? Because scholars of hadith still put these in their books. And if it was to be rejected, they wouldn't have placed it in their book. This is rule number one. And many of the ai who wrote their books of hadith are actually very clear about this. Like Imam Abu Dawood, he says, if something has some weakness to it, I'll clarify. But if I'm silent, that means it's acceptable and you can use it. Now he's putting something that's weak in there. Why? Because he knows that there's a high possibility that the Prophet ﷺ still could have said it, even though there is some weakness. Which means there's some weakness that he might not have said it or might not have happened exactly in the same way, but there's a likelihood that it could. Because there's a likelihood on either side, he's still placing it. And this is especially the case because a lot of the scholars of hadith, just to be clear, were of the opinion that it's still better to follow a weak hadith than to follow my own personal opinion. Okay? Let me say this again. Many scholars of hadith, especially Imam Ahmad, this is also his whole madhab is built on this. But Imam Ahmad was Amir al-Mu'minin fil hadith. Many scholars of hadith followed his, but they were part of the same school, especially like Abu Dawood and others. where their opinion was, if it's weak, we can still use it, provided that its weakness is not severe, and we'll get into what severe means. And there's nothing that contradicts it, that goes against it. And there's no reason not to use it. So even some, and I'll give you a prime example. Let's say we have water. This is a fiqh lesson, everybody's taken this before. We have water, and one of its three attributes has changed with a najasa, right? ما تغير بطعمه ولونه وريحه, right? Its smell, its taste, or its color with the najasa, then it's najis itself, right? Now guess what? All four schools of fiqh take this hadith without any question. It's part of their, everybody uses it. Guess what? It's weak. It's actually unanimously weak. Now this doesn't mean that it's fabricated or we don't use it. Weak, remember, weak means that it very well could have been said. And the thing is, all of the schools of fiqh actually agree that its meaning is correct, even if the chain is weak. And so this is where you get into, once you start studying these types of things, you'll find there's many hadith that are actually weak chain-wise, but actually very authentic meaning-wise. Their meaning are actually correct, and we all unanimously use it. Now, does a person say, well, if it's weak, I can't use it anymore? What are you going to use? This is actually the only thing that we have about, specifically to this concise, this clear on the subject. Likewise, we have actually authentic hadith that we don't use. They can't be authentic. I'll mention one example. Now this, by the way, is very controversial as well. But the authenticity is needed. Because remember, ultimately it's probabilistic. We're not saying yaqinan. Even if I say it's sahih, I'm not saying that the Prophet said 100% said these words. Unless we have so much corroborating evidence. Otherwise, a lot of it, at the end of the word, is غلبة الظن. We're close to certain. But can I say the Prophet verbatimly said that? Aslan, the scholars of hadith know that that's not the case. The scholars of hadith know that that's not the case. I'm not trying to put doubt in hadith or anything. Aslan, we apply it, we use it anyways, right? But an example. There's the hadith that says eating the hyena is halal. Lahm al-daba'. Right? The meat of a hyena is halal. Who here would like to eat hyena if it was presented? Everybody's like, no, there's no way, right? Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, Ibn al-Qayyim has a tract in his book where he actually discusses this point, and he says, la yumkin. He says it's impossible. When you look at all these other, now it is authentic. He's saying, Aslan, it's in the books, it's in Abu Dawood. I just mentioned Sunan Abu Dawood, it's actually there. Now he says, with all the other evidence that we have, where the Prophet forbade eating lahm al-siba', animals of prey, and specifically ones that have claws, etc. This can't be the case. In other places, he actually discusses. He says it could be, because he's trying to defend the idea that it is authentic, right? It could be that because hyenas are not hunters, they're actually scavengers. This could be the case, but some others reply that because it's a scavenger, maybe it's even it's more likely to actually not be eaten. We wouldn't want to, right? By the way, there's some modern scholars. I remember one of our teachers. He said you don't have to eat hyena. By the way, just because it says that it's halal doesn't mean that you have to eat it. And by the way, many scholars have said that even though its narration is authentic, the meaning is obviously not authentic, right? And it could be that it's a concession, a person could use it. Let's say, for example, there's a person who comes from China and he wants to accept Islam. And it's like, in my culture, we eat dogs. And some, provinces in China, they eat dogs regularly, just like we eat goats. You know what I mean? All the time, they'd look at you like, why are you eating that goat? And we look at them and why are you eating this dog? Right? And a person could say, well, we do have a hadith about hyenas, and hyenas technically are a type of dog. It's a type of wild dog, a canine. Tayyib. Maybe you can allow it for them because it's their culture. He said this could be one of the wisdoms why behind, and we have this here. Ultimately, what I'm saying, what does this have to do with hadith, is that there's a science, there's a discussion. Many scholars will agree on the authenticity, but sometimes they don't. You'll find diverging opinions on the authenticity of individual hadiths. For the most part, what we accept, majority of scholars agree upon. What we don't accept, majority of scholars agree upon. By the way, there's a fourth category, which is mawdu' or da'if jiddan. Da'if jiddan, very weak, means that there's no corroborating evidence. The person has been a known, Yani the person who's narrating it is a known fabricator, a known liar, etc. Yani we can't take it. Or that we know it is mawdu'. I mean, it's completely fabricated. In this case, it belongs in its own book. And there were scholars who dedicated their lives to write just books of fabricated hadith. Why? So that Muslims are aware of what a fabricated hadith looks like. And in fact, Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah writes a brilliant book, I think it's brilliant, where he gives Muslims a way to figure out the authenticity of a hadith without necessarily having access to going back to the chains of narrations per se. He says just based upon certain themes and certain ideas, you can immediately tell whether a hadith is fabricated or not. This is very controversial, by the way, but I think he's brilliant because a lot of the points that he mentions are awesome. For example, one thing he says, if a person comes to you with a hadith about any flower, know that it's fake. Or any fruit, other than the known fruits that he's talked about. There was a guy back in the day, he wanted to sell, this is true, he was a watermelon seller. He used to sell watermelons. He used to grow them and sell them. And so he made up a hadith to sell more watermelons. And I got a WhatsApp message from somebody sending these hadith that he found in one of the books, not knowing that these are completely fabricated. And any student of hadith knows this, that these types of hadith are fabricated. So why did he do this? He wants to sell more watermelons. And it's clear, there's a business incentive. This guy wants to sell, he wants to sell watermelons. So he made up, and he says, أكل أهل الجنة البطيخ وكذا. يعني he's going in, ومن أكل البطيخ كان له يعني this, and he writes all these things about, and you're just like, what? And also reading it, if you've read a lot of ahadith, and you read this, you're like, this just sounds so weird and so off. It doesn't make any sense. Yani the brother here is smiling, but clearly, anybody who's familiar, you're like, this doesn't make any sense. And people will send them in WhatsApp forwards, you know what I mean? Like, check out, batikh is ta'amu ahl al-jannah, and this and this and this. Now, here's the thing, just to be clear. Is it ta'amu ahl al-jannah? Sure. Because in Jannah, I can get anything that I want. And a person could wish potentially for batikh. So we can't say that it's not, but I can't say that it's a hadith. I can't say that, قال Rasulullah sallam, this is where the person loses their akhirah for the sake of just selling some watermelons. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us and to guide us. So, people did fabricate, but we know these fabrications are very clear. We can easily pick them out. And so if somebody comes to you with a food item, and says, whoever eats this, then this will happen, most likely it's also weak. Or if not, outright fabricated, right? Just to be clear, these are some of the themes that Ibn al-Qayyim says. You have to be careful. So similar with like clothing items. Whoever wears this type of fabric, what? He never talked about fabrics and all these. This only happened later because the Prophet literally wore whatever was available to him because of the poverty that was existing and so forth. So check for authenticity. If it's authentic, great. If it's weak and it's problematic, khalas, we've problem solved. But we have to realize that just because something is weak doesn't mean that we automatically dismiss it. That was the point of this whole point, right? Just because something weak doesn't mean that we throw it out. We can still, but we have to be academically honest and honest to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, point out its weakness. And this is why you'll hear sometimes in the khutbahs, many of the khutbah will tell you, there's this hadith, but just to know, it's a little bit weak. There's some weaknesses to it that they've mentioned, but here it is. That's it. That way we're clear on things, inshallah ta'ala. طيب, so that was point number 6. Point number 7 in the toolkit to engage with the hadith is to understand maqasid al-sharia. Maqasid al-sharia, very quickly, are the goals of the laws and the legislation of the Prophet ﷺ that we know, and of the Quran, of course, that we know that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives a commandment or a prohibition, or the Prophet ﷺ does the same, gives a commandment or prohibition, that there's a wisdom behind that, even if I don't know what it is. We know that of the goals of the Sharia are the preservation of life, the preservation of the intellect, the mind, the preservation of deen, the preservation of wealth, the preservation of honor, the preservation of your progeny, your kids, and the future generations. These all have rights upon us. And that the Sharia comes to preserve these things. So if there's a hadith, and it's authentic, and all these things have been met, and I don't fully understand it, I have to understand, though, that there's a wisdom behind it. Now, if I can investigate that wisdom, great, nurun ala nur. And a lot of times you'll find this. This is why Islam, I believe, as a Muslim, that Islam offers solutions to every human problem in existence. I genuinely believe this. Now, this doesn't mean that I personally, Anwar, have the solutions. No, I don't. Right? But I do believe Islam as a religion does. And this is why it's so beautiful, because you can literally research and you can look into, and there are lessons to be gleaned from every part of our religion. I genuinely believe this, and this has been found, and it's tried and true. But a lot of times we'll read a hadith, we'll hear of an incident, we'll even read some of the Quran, and we'll be like, "Ya akhi, I don't understand this. How could this be allowed? How could this actually happen? Ya akhi, there's a wisdom behind it. Do you understand this? Do you understand at least that there's a wisdom?" Yes, that's all we need to do. And this will help with the patience, right? This will help with accepting it. There were many people who did, and in the past, reject certain elements of the Sunnah simply because they didn't understand it. Especially like the Mu'tazila. Now they didn't do this frequently. I mean, it's not like the whole thing, but many times they would reject things because they don't understand the wisdom behind it. We don't want to fall into this trap. We have to trust that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the full picture of everything. And we just have a small portion of a small side of the picture. Right? Your life, your experience is just one tiny experience, part of what is known as human life. And for us, sometimes we assume that we know so much and the sunnah has to be this certain way, meaning we want the sunnah to fall into what we believe is true and what we see around us. Or what we want, a lot of times we fall into this trap where we want Allah to do to the world what we would do ourselves. Ya akhi, that's impossible aslan. If you're fair, you wouldn't allow your wife to do the same thing because you know that she sees the world differently than you. And then you're applying this logic to Allah. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ تَعَالَى اللَّهُ عَمَّا يَقُولُونَ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is far elevated above what they say. We can't do this. So a lot of times we'll question Allah's wisdom, or we'll question Islamic wisdom, not knowing, if we were just fair with ourselves and with our own capacities, we'd realize that we can't do that. So sometimes we'll come across things that we don't fully understand. Maybe like the hyena issue. Maybe I don't fully understand why this is authentic. Or maybe I think that it's not authentic. Regardless, maybe there's a wisdom behind it. And like I said, there was that one scholar who said, Ya akhi, maybe some, in some culture, this is what they want to do. And maybe that's a barrier for them to accept Islam. Ya akhi, no, come accept Islam. And we can discuss the issue of you eating dogs later. You know what I mean? But the idea is, there are things beyond sometimes our understanding. And for us to assume that we understand everything the way that it is, this is categorically false. You, at the age of 40, understand the world differently than you yourself at the age of 30. And you at the age of 30 understand the world differently than you did at the age of 20. So for you to assume that everything has to conform to your own vision is changing. So we have to take this into consideration, inshallah ta'ala. طيب. Tool number 8 is understanding the historical context through which the hadith were narrated. Historical context means what? Historical context means that I understand the life and the times of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions and everything that happened. And we have an incident. I'll share a story. Aisha radiallahu anha rejected a hadith initially because she didn't understand the historical context. Now this is not a dig against Aisha radiallahu anha, it shows their integrity, that they were looking at this and said, wait, this hadith doesn't make sense. Now, given this hadith by itself, 100% it does not make sense, and I would actually agree with Aisha radiallahu anha. In fact, many scholars did. What did she disagree with? She heard a hadith that says that the dead يُعَذَّبُ الْمَيِّتُ بِبُكَاءِ أَهْلِهِ عَلَيْهِ. That the dead person, the deceased, is tortured and tormented because of the tears and the crying of his loved ones upon him after he dies. Let me repeat this. The deceased is tortured or tormented because of the weeping of his relatives or his loved ones upon him after he dies. And Aisha rejected this hadith. Now this hadith is authentic, but she rejected it when she heard it from one of the other companions because she says, how can a person who's dead be punished for the actions of another person? Even if he was alive, one person is not held accountable for the actions of another person. And she quoted the ayah of the Quran, وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى. A sinner shall not bear the sins of another person. Right? So if a person is crying and it's not befitting for them to cry, why am I at fault? I didn't do anything. This is all good. This is perfect. Her reasoning is very good. However, we said it's the historical context. And so they pointed out that another, one of the tabi'een, he said that it used to be from the customs of Jahiliyyah, pre-Islamic days, that a person in his inheritance, in his will that he would leave to his inheritors, is that they hire criers, professional criers, bakka'in. Okay? Meaning these are people, this is one of their jobs, is to professionally cry for you once you pass away. Now this is completely foreign to, we've never heard of such a thing. You're like, what? Yes. So they would actually pay people. So on the janazah, just like nowadays, people pay somebody to come read Quran, which is also we shouldn't be doing that either, but that's a different issue. They pay somebody to come and cry in the funeral. So in the azah, when everybody's coming to visit, they would pay some people, here you go, here you go, here you go. And these people would go there and they would cry and they would make a scene. And because of their crying, and here's the thing, crying is contagious. When we see somebody crying, we have no power, but we get emotional too, and we want to cry because of their crying. And this is actually why they're hired, by the way. And they wanted to get all the tears out. They wanted to get the sadness out. Let's get it out from now, so they're no longer sad at this individual, right? Which is actually, and if you think about it, it's a good way to mourn in the sense that you're getting all the emotions out, but it's not healthy to get it out all at once like this, and you know that it's fake, and this person is clearly being paid to cry. So anyways, then it brings up a lot of issues. The Prophet ﷺ forbade this. And he said that the person who dies now and pays, and he puts this in his will that, hey, I want you guys to cry. Make sure that you cry a lot when I'm dead. And here's money so that you guys can pay somebody to come and cry. That is what's haram. Otherwise, the natural crying that happens from an individual over their deceased, nothing will affect the dead person. That will not. So I hope inshallah ta'ala that this is clear. So knowing that historical context will make the hadith make sense. We won't reject it anymore. And in fact, I think this was actually clarified to her, and she came around eventually to it. Right? Oh yeah, 100%. Them slapping themselves, tearing their clothes. Part of the scene is that they would shed their clothes and they would be beating themselves and all these things. All of these things are rejected in Islam categorically. And if the dead person had asked the relatives to do any of these things, obviously that's haram and they can't do them. And that's why he would be punished. Otherwise he's not punished for that. So knowing the historical context of the hadith helps in understanding the hadith and won't be problematic anymore. And this is why in this case it was problematized, because we didn't understand the full historical context. And once we understand it, inshallah ta'ala, it won't be. Tool number 9 is gathering all supporting narrations. Meaning, let's say I'm reading through a book of hadith and I find one hadith about a certain topic that I find problematic. And I say, wait, this can't be, this seems a little bit off, this is weird. One thing that will help is by me finding and searching, and now this is actually very easy and doable, is to find all other narrations that I can find on this topic to help me actually form a better idea. Why? Because we said a lot of times one narration isn't complete. And a lot of times there'll be slight differences here and there, or one will be just the statement of the Prophet ﷺ without the context. So, here's the example for this. The Prophet ﷺ says, "Man sanna fil Islam sunnatan hasana, falahu ajruha wa ajru man amila biha." Whoever gives a good example, or is a good example in Islam, right? Or he establishes a good example, meaning he does something new, then he gets the reward of it and the reward of everybody who does it. A person could come and say, wait a second, without context, a person can say, wow, this hadith says that if I do something new in Islam and people follow me, I get not only the reward of myself, but the reward of everybody who follows me. Khalas, perfect. Guys, you know what we're going to do? We're going to start praying Isha 5 rak'at. An extra rak'ah, an extra rak'ah. What's wrong with an extra rak'ah? Why are you guys against it? You guys are just limiting yourself to 4? I'm going to pray 5. In fact, it makes sense to me. Why? Because all 5 daily prayers are 5. So it makes sense to end on 5, not on 4. So I'm just going to do this something new and everybody's going to follow me. What do you guys think? And everybody's like, yeah, let's go for it, Sheikh. You know what I mean? We trust you, we love you. Has anybody in the history of Islam said this? No, of course not, right? But we're making an example that a person could think that this is encouraging you to do something new and different. And if people follow you, you get reward. But that's actually not what it means, because this actually goes against the idea of bid'ah, the idea of innovation, the idea of established consensus, the idea of following the sunnah, etc. So what does this hadith actually mean? Whoever sanna fil Islam sunnatan hasana, he gives a good sunnah in Islam. And the wording, Without context, it's hard. And that's actually literally a body of one of the hadith. Now, when we gather supporting narrations, we find other narrations add the context in which the Prophet ﷺ said these words. طيب, what was the context? It says that there was a tribe that came and they were from Mudar. This is one of the tribes in the Arabian Peninsula, and they came to Medina disheveled, full of dust, hungry. Some of them, their bones were showing. Some of them barely had garments to cover them. They went through a severe drought and they literally came walking with the clothes on their back to Medina so that the Prophet ﷺ can help them. The whole tribe came. And when the Prophet ﷺ saw them, he was hurt so much by seeing them. And the thing is, Medina had been hit by the same drought. And so there wasn't a lot of money available to help. But he's like, we need to help these people. He literally got up on the minbar. It wasn't the time of Jummah or anything, but he gets up on the pulpit and he starts to encourage everybody. Your brothers have come. We need somebody we need you guys to help. Whoever can provide food, whoever can provide clothing, whoever can provide anything. And nobody responded. Nobody responded. And it's, things are, and then again, an exhortation. Why? Because the companions themselves were going through the same drought. Everybody's struggling. A lot of them are thinking like, man, if I give these people food, I have no food left at home. For a lot of the Sahaba, especially when they were poor. And they were all looking through like, what are we going to do? It wasn't until one of the men from the Ansar, one of the Ansaris, went to his house, came back with 2 large bags, it says sacks. And he was dragging both of them, and he places them in front of the Prophet ﷺ. And one was full of clothes, and the other was full of food. And he brings them and says, here you go, Ya Rasulullah. We don't know his situation, he just brings them and puts them. And upon this, the Prophet ﷺ, it says, we saw his face, it was so bright. كَأَنَّهُ مَذْهَبًا. It was like it was made out of gold. And he was so happy, he was so joyous because somebody started. And because of his example, everybody now started to bring. Because of that one person's example. Meaning, it's as if they knew what he could have done. When they saw how much he did, they were like, okay, if he's putting himself in danger almost financially, then maybe we can also stretch ourselves a little bit and do this. And because he was the first one, the Prophet ﷺ then said, مَنْ سَنَّ فِي الْإِسْلَامِ سُنَّةً حَسَنَةً فَلَهُ أَجْرُهَا وَأَجْرُ مَنْ عَمِلَ بِهَا. Whoever provides a good example in Islam, then he gets its reward and the reward of everybody who follows his example. So this is something already halal, already established in the Sunnah. He's following literally the Sunnah of the Prophet. But because he was the first one to do it, and because of his actions, everybody else joined in, he gets the reward. And that's a beautiful thing. And that's what the hadith actually means. So now by understanding the full context and by seeing supporting evidence, we actually see what happens. And obviously, this is why, like in fundraisers and stuff, it's always better to be first than to be last, because people usually are following your example. They see when you're actually. And this is why there's no problem in doing public fundraisers, especially when it's a good cause, and especially when we know that we can encourage one another, right? And so this is why the Prophet ﷺ did that. So this is tool number 9, meaning we know what we call sabab al-wurud, which is why the hadith happened, right? Through the supporting narrations, meaning why did the Prophet ﷺ say what he said. Last but not least, number 10. And this is where we face seemingly contradictory or problematic hadith. Okay? So after doing all 9, we reach number 10, which is, how do we face problematic hadith? And there are steps to this that have been laid out by the scholars that actually deal in this. Now, if a person wants to take this endeavor and kind of look into it, that's great. A lot of times this is left to the scholars who are specialists, but we have to realize that there are ways of reconciling seeming contradictions. Meaning, when we say seeming contradictions, we mean that it seems to us as being a contradiction, where in fact it isn't. And there are ways of remedying this. I'll mention an example. 2 ahadith, both are found in Bukhari. Both of these ahadith are found in Bukhari. This is problem number 1. Would Bukhari narrate 2 ahadith that contradict each other? He actually did. Did he do this on purpose? Yes, he did. He knew exactly what he was doing. Okay? And he does this, it's brilliant, by the way. Now, a person reading this would say, hey, wait a second. I found 2 hadith and not only they're contradicting, but they're in the same book. Man, your scholars don't know what they're doing. A person could say this. But in fact, they knew exactly what they were doing. And we have to kind of keep an open mind to this idea that they can actually contradict. So, for example, before we mention the Bukhari example, There are the hadith, for example, that mention one, a prohibition for visiting the graves, and then another hadith that says, no, you can visit the graves. These are contradictory. It's either you can or you can't. There's no middle ground here. If I find one that says you can drink alcohol and another one that says you can't drink alcohol, I say, wait a second, what's going on? By the way, that's found in the Quran. A person who reads the Quran will say, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, do not approach the prayer while you're drunk. And then another verse that says, khamr is haram anyways. You know what I mean? La taqrabu says, do not, it says, fajtanibu. It says, avoid alcohol. So a person might say, which one is it? It's either halal or it's not. Come on, obviously within the science of tafsir we figure out which one it is, and actually it's prohibited. We know this. In fact, this is ijma'. There's unanimous consensus on that issue. But let's say, for example, visiting the graves is not found in the Quran. There's nothing in the Quran about visiting the graves. So look in the Sunnah. In the Sunnah there's a hadith that says it's prohibited, and then there's another hadith that says that it's allowed. What do I do? So number one, we look at which one was narrated later. This is what we did to the Quran. We know that verse of Fajtanibuh was revealed after the verse of that. So we clearly know, okay, so that was after, that one takes precedence. But sometimes in the Sunnah that's not exactly clear. Sometimes we need to apply supporting narrations, etc. And in fact, in one of the supporting narrations, the Prophet himself ﷺ actually said, أَلَا إِنِّي قَدْ نَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْ زِيَارَةِ الْقُبُورِ أَلَا فَالْآنَ فَزُورُوهَا فَإِنَّهَا تُذَكِّرُكُمْ بِالْآخِرَةِ أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. It says, I had previously, now this narration solves the problem for us, but you have to find it. If you just found one of the prohibitions, you're like, wait a second, this is confusing. It says, I had previously prohibited you from visiting the graves, and now I am allowing it. Now it's allowed. Because it indeed reminds you of the hereafter. Now, why was the prohibition of visiting the graves initially anyways? Yeah, exactly. Because of the fear of shirk. Because of the fear that they were going to do something mistaken, and because some people used to venerate their ancestors and worship them, etc. And obviously the Prophet ﷺ wants to prohibit anything that could lead to shirk, right? Abwab, anything that could do that. And so that's why it was prohibited. This is one of the opinions. And once things were very clear, they're not close to shirk anymore, etc., you can go and visit the graves because it indeed reminds you of the hereafter, and it does. When you go and you visit, especially when you have relatives there and whatnot, you're like, man, this is this same person I used to see and hug and kiss and talk to, and now he's down there, and I know I'm going to be there soon as well myself. So because of that reminder, it's actually good and healthy. You know what I mean? If the person is safe from the shirk. So, reconciling is necessary. The two hadith, and inshallah ta'ala we'll end on those, because we didn't want to take too much time. The two hadith that we said were contradictory are the hadith that narrate the marriage of the Prophet ﷺ to Maymuna. That happened in the 7th year of the Hijrah, when the Prophet ﷺ went back to Mecca. This is after Hudaybiyah. Hudaybiyah happened in the year 6. When they wanted to do Umrah, they weren't allowed, but they said come back the following year, and they did. They went back the following year, and in that Umrah, this is called Umrah al-Qada, the Prophet ﷺ married Maymuna radiallahu anha, the last of his wives. This is the last wife that he married in her lifetime, Maymuna radiallahu anha. And when he married her, we have a hadith that says that the Prophet ﷺ married her when he was in a state of ihram. And we have another hadith that says that no, he was not in a state of ihram. Now both are in Bukhari, which means both are authentic. Right? Now here's the thing. Why is this an issue? If he was in ihram or he wasn't in ihram? Because one of the prohibitions of what you can do in ihram is that you cannot get married. A person can't get married when you're in ihram. So if you're in ihram and you want to get married, you have to hurry up and finish your umrah or your hajj. Right? Now, some have said that it is permissible to do the aqd, or even a promise, but you can't actually consummate. Because even, let's say you are married, aslan you can't be intimate with your wife during the ihram. That's literally one of the things that's prohibited. So based upon that, you can't even actually get married as well. But there were scholars who said, well, maybe you can do an aqd. Actually, the majority still hold the opinion that you can't even do an aqd. It's not befitting aslan. Why would you do a contract? You're going to hajj. it defeats the whole purpose of Hajj for you to go be looking for a wife as well. You know what I mean? You shouldn't be going there with that intention. And if you find somebody, you're like, hey sister, so we're both, here on Hajj, let's do a, la, ya akhi, you know what I mean? I'm from America, come with me. It's not going to work. Or whatever the person is using to entice them. So, I hold the opinion that, Allahu A'lam, I could be wrong, but that even aqd doesn't seem to be befitting. So, here's the issue. How do we reconcile this? One hadith that's authentic, and it's attributed to Abdullah ibn Abbas. And he says that Maymuna, now who's Maymuna to him? Maymuna is his aunt, khalatahu. Right? It's his mother's sister. This is why Abdullah ibn Abbas, after this marriage, was so happy, because he would go and visit his aunt frequently so that he could be even closer to the Prophet ﷺ and learn from him. And so he, on multiple occasions, would say, I would go and stay the night at Maymuna's house when I know that it was the Prophet's night. And he would stand in tahajjud with the Prophet, and then we have that incident where the Prophet ﷺ was standing way too long in tahajjud, and Abdullah ibn Abbas is like, I wanted to leave, this is going too long. And he was one of many companions who went through a similar experience. And he was like, I thought this is going to be good, and then it turns out that the Prophet ﷺ is reading Al-Baqarah, and I thought that he would, yarka inda al-mi'ah, and then he kept on going, 200 verses in. I said, okay, now he's going to make ruku'. Nope. He finished Al-Baqarah. I said, okay, now he's going to make ruku'. Nope. He goes into Surah Al-Nisa. By the way, he didn't go into Al-Imran. He went into Al-Imran later. And I said, Surah Al-Nisa already? And then he's going into that surah. And then he said, okay, he's going to make ruku' after 100. No. And we're still standing there. And he says, I wanted to sit down. I wanted to just leave the salah. I couldn't handle it. And also, I wouldn't be able to. I would be like, man, I'm done. But so he's going through kind of similar things, right? So that's Abdullah ibn Abbas. He says it's his aunt. So he says, now he would have access. He says that they were in a state of ihram when they got married. What about the hadith that says that they were not in a state of ihram? It was narrated by Maymuna herself. It's narrated by Maymuna herself, and she says, we had been finished with our ihram, and that's when the Prophet ﷺ married me. Now, just to be clear, right? Who's more of an authority? The person who it happened to, or a person who's narrating about it? Third party. The person that it happened to. Now, we're not discounting Abdullah ibn Abbas, right? Abdullah ibn Abbas is narrating what he knows. This is number one. Number two, Al-Bukhari is including both to also tell us that perhaps both are correct. Can we reconcile? Maybe Abdullah ibn Abbas is talking about the idea of marrying Maymuna, which actually did occur to the Prophet ﷺ beforehand, and the actual consummation of the marriage being after the ihram. So this is further reconciliation. So reconciliation number one that we said, reconciliation number one was that, well, maybe one knows more than the other. Maybe one is just narrating what they thought happened. Okay. Number two seems to actually be a little bit stronger, is where he's saying that, no, Abdullah ibn Abbas is maybe talking about the proposal, or at least the idea of marrying her, but then the actual marriage and consummation of the marriage happened after they had finished the umrah and they were in a state of halal, they كانوا في حل, right, after their ihram had ended. Okay? So both could be correct. There's a third opinion, and it actually says, and by the way, this is recorded, and many scholars like Ibn al-Arabi and others actually hold this opinion, and they said that the Prophet ﷺ did in fact marry her and do the contract in a state of ihram, but only consummated the marriage afterwards, as Maymuna says. Both are correct, but that being allowed to make marriage contracts in a state of ihram is what we call khasisa min khasa'is al-nubuwah. So this is something that's special to the Prophet ﷺ and not to anyone else. Meaning, this is one of the things that are afforded to the Prophet ﷺ, because we know there are certain things that the Prophet ﷺ can do that we can't. For example, the Prophet ﷺ could marry any woman that he wanted to, as long as she was halal, from the women that are halal to him. He could marry as many as he wants. That's what I should have said. We have a limit, right? We only have up to 4. And unless in these days, it's 1 and you're lucky to have 1. Right? But typically the Sharia allows up to 4. But the Prophet ﷺ wasn't stopping. He was allowed to marry more than 4. Can anybody say, well, I'm like the Prophet, I'm following the footsteps of the Prophet, I want to marry 9 as well, or 11? You know what I mean? We can't say that. Because this is a special thing for the Prophet. And by the way, there's others that were allowed for the Prophet that are not allowed to us, but that's a whole different concept. So what we're saying is, and going back, inshallah ta'ala, is that there are ways of reconciling these, knowing the context, knowing what has been done. And by the way, like I said, scholars have dedicated their lives to actually doing a lot of these things. So these are the 10 tools that will help a person read the hadith, so that when you do read, which we encourage people to do, there are many books that a person can start with. The 40 Nawawiyya, we're going through the series, the top 50 hadith, books like Read the Sunnah and others. And then if a person wants to even read through the book, you can. We're not saying that it's not possible, but just have these tools, inshallah ta'ala, in mind to help you along the way. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Anybody have any questions? Inshallah ta'ala. Comments, concerns, issues? Yeah, tafadda. Yeah, so like I said, not using, so the question is about da'if hadith. Can we use them on issues of halal and haram? So many of the madhahib, the scholars, especially like Abu Hanifa and others, have said that it's not allowed to use a weak hadith in matters of halal and haram. This is clear. And it's completely understandable why they would say this, right? However, this is contrasted with the Hanabila, and specifically Imam Ahmad, who is on record saying that he would prefer to use in the absence of any authentic hadith, in the absence of something clear from the companions even, or even from the second generation, the tabi'een, in the absence of anything like this, he would prefer to use a weak hadith, as long as the weakness isn't severe. Illa qadiha, it has a problem or something, as long as the weakness, he would prefer to use that over his own judgment. Because ultimately, what are we doing? If I don't use a weak hadith and I have to figure out halal and haram on an issue that doesn't exist, or that there's not a clear hadith on, we do have to use our better judgment, which is then we go into ijtihad, we do qiyas, we do a lot of these things that have been mentioned. And so this is where there's a difference of opinion on whether it's allowed to be used or not, right? And that's the classical example that's given. And Allah knows best. I think it does come down to, what does the weak hadith say? A lot of the context around that. Maybe what is our judgment? What have Muslims been doing? We have, one of the advantages that we have over people, even like Abu Hanifa and Imam Ahmad, not that we're better than them, we're not. I'm saying an advantage that we have is now we have a huge tradition. There's rarely an issue except that scholars have written about and talked about. And even modern issues, alhamdulillah, many scholars have talked about them and are talking about them. So for us, the issue is kind of moot, meaning it's been dealt with usually. Right? We can maybe use them, in kind of new issues, new challenges that come up, but those are as they come, so to speak. So yeah. Jazakallah khair, thank you. Barakallah feekum, jazakallah khairan. Subhanakallah wa hamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.